The skillet felt heavy in her hand, heavy enough to split a man's skull clean open. And the stranger on her porch was smiling, a slow, easy smile like he didn't have a care in the world. The snow was coming down hard, thick flakes swirling in the lamplight, and the wind was howling like a hungry wolf. But the real danger wasn't the storm. It was the man. She hadn't seen a man smile at her, not like that, in 30 years. 30 years of silence and solitude, and the sharp, cold edge of being alone. Her knuckles were white where she gripped the iron handle. "What do you want?" she asked, and her voice sounded like rust and disuse. He just kept smiling, his eyes crinkling at the corners. They were kind eyes, but she'd seen kind eyes turn cruel before. "Evening, ma'am. Name's Dale. Caught out in this storm. Was hoping for a spot by your fire till morning." She looked him over. Young, strong, a Winchester rifle held loose in one hand, a bedroll slung over his shoulder. The clothes of a man who lived with the mountains as his only neighbor. He was a long way from anywhere. Too long. Her grip tightened on the skillet. "I don't take in strangers." Her voice rose, sharp as a shard of ice. "Especially not men." She leaned forward, her face a mask of bitter pride carved by decades of loneliness. "No man's touched me since 1850, and that's how it's staying." The declaration hung between them, a wall of words more solid than her cabin door. She expected him to flinch, to sneer, to turn and leave. Most men would have, but this one didn't. His smile faded, replaced by something else. Something like understanding. He took a small step back, his hands held open and away from his rifle. A sign of peace. "Mrs. Keene," he said, his voice soft but clear over the wind, "I give you my word as a Christian man. I'm only asking for warmth, nothing more." She stared at him, her heart a cold, hard knot in her chest. The wind whipped a flurry of snow through the crack in the door, stinging her face. He didn't even blink. There was a stillness to him, a patience that unnerved her. She lived alone for 30 years. She knew how to handle trouble, but she also knew what a night like this could do to a man caught out in the open. "You can come in," she said, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. "But you keep your distance. You try anything foolish, and this skillet will be the last thing you see." He nodded, his eyes full of a strange sort of gratitude. "Yes, ma'am. Much obliged." She opened the door just enough for him to slip inside, and the cold followed him in. He brought the scent of pine and snow and the wild, lonely places of the world. He set his rifle by the door, unwrapped his coat, and moved to the hearth without a word, slow and deliberate, like he was trying not to spook a wild animal. Maggie watched his every move from the other side of the room, the skillet still held tight in her hand. The firelight flickered across his face, a good face, an honest face. But she'd been fooled by an honest face once before, a lifetime ago. She didn't lower her weapon, not yet. The cabin was small, but it was hers. Every log, every chink of mud, every jar of preserves on the shelves was a testament to her own two hands. She'd built this life out of the ashes of another one, and she'd be damned if she let some smiling stranger tear it down in a single night. He settled on a rough-hewn stool, stretching his hands toward the flames. He didn't speak. The silence grew, thick and heavy, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the storm raging outside. It was a test. She knew it. He was waiting for her to break, to ask questions to fill the quiet. But she was a master of silence. She lived in it for 30 years. Finally, she lowered the skillet, setting it on the table with a soft clink. She sank into her rocking chair, the familiar creak of the runners, a small comfort. Her eyes never left him. He was a puzzle, a disruption in the perfect, lonely order of her world. And as the fire burned low, she couldn't shake the feeling that letting him in was either the best thing she'd ever done or the very last. Dawn broke gray and cold, the storm having passed in the night, leaving the world buried in a thick blanket of white. Maggie woke with a start, her hand immediately reaching for the skillet she kept by her bed. The cabin was quiet, too quiet. She crept out of her small bedroom, every sense on high alert. The stranger Dale was gone. His bedroll was neatly tied, His rifle was missing from its spot by the door. A cold dread washed over her. He'd left, but had he taken anything? Her eyes scanned the shelves, the food stores, the small tin box where she kept her deed, and the few coins she possessed. Everything seemed to be in its place. Then she heard it, a rhythmic thump, 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 from outside. She moved to the window, rubbing a clear patch on the frosted glass, and she saw him. He was in her yard, his back to the cabin, swinging her axe with a steady, powerful rhythm. He was splitting firewood from the dead pine that had fallen last autumn. A neat stack was already growing beside him, higher than any she'd managed to build all season. Maggie lowered the skillet. Her breath fogged the glass. It had been years, decades, since a man had done a chore on her land without being asked. Thomas, her husband, had always been one for grand dreams, not practical work. He'd talk of gold nuggets the size of her fist, but he'd let the woodpile dwindle to nothing. When Dale came back inside, his arms loaded with wood, his cheeks red from the cold, he found her stoking the fire. She didn't look at him. "Didn't ask you to do that," she said, her voice gruff. "No, ma'am, you didn't," he replied, stacking the wood neatly by the hearth. But it needed doing. As she prepared a meager breakfast of cornbread and coffee, he didn't sit and wait. His eyes scanned the cabin, and they were sharp eyes, missing nothing. They settled on her old cook stove. "Your stove's got a bad crack, Mrs. Keene," he said, his tone respectful. "Leaking heat. If you got some scrap iron and wire, I could patch that proper." Her hand stilled. "Been meaning to fix it myself." It was a lie. She tried, patching it with clay and prayers, but the crack just kept getting worse. "There's some old wire in the lean-to," she admitted, her pride warring with the bone-deep cold that had settled in the cabin. "Bit of iron, too, from an old wagon wheel." He just nodded and went to fetch the materials. As he worked, his hands sure and skilled, Maggie watched him. He moved with a quiet competence that was both comforting and deeply unsettling. He was making himself useful. He was making himself necessary, and that was a dangerous thing. He finished the repair just as the cornbread was coming out of the oven. The patch was neat and strong, a dark scar of new iron against the old rusted stove. Already the cabin felt warmer. "That should hold," he said, wiping his hands on a rag. "Been a long time since I've seen a proper repair job," she admitted. The words brought a memory, sharp and unwelcome. "Thomas, my husband, he was never much good with his hands." She turned away, busying herself with the coffee pot. But the dam of her silence had been breached. "Went off to California in 1850, said he'd send for me when he struck it rich. Never did. Learned to manage on my own. Don't need any man's help now." "No, ma'am, that's plain to see," Dale said gently. "But sometimes it's not about needing help. Sometimes it's just about sharing the load." They ate in silence. The sun streamed through the window, catching the dust motes dancing in the air. The repaired stove radiated a steady, comforting warmth. It was a fragile peace, an unspoken truce. But as Dale reached for another piece of cornbread, his sleeve pulled back. And Maggie saw it, a tattoo on his wrist, a coiled snake, faded and old but unmistakable. It was the mark of the Black Creek Raiders, a gang of outlaws that had terrorized the territories years ago. Thieves and killers, the lot of them. Her blood ran cold. The kind eyes, the gentle smile, the helpful hands. It was all a lie. She had let a wolf into her fold, and the door was already barred by a mountain of snow. Maggie's hand instinctively crept toward the skillet on the table. Her mind raced. The Black Creek Raiders hadn't been heard from in years. They'd scattered, been hunted down, or so the story went. But the snake tattoo was their mark, known to anyone who lived in these parts long enough. Dale didn't seem to notice her stare. He was looking out the window, his expression thoughtful. "Been traveling these parts a while," he said, his voice calm. "Seen some troubling things. Railroads pushing through, buying up land, or taking it when folks won't sell." He was trying to distract her, to lull her into a false sense of security while he planned, what? To rob her? To kill her for her small, lonely plot of land? The warmth from the stove now felt suffocating. "What do you mean, taking it?" she asked, her voice tight. He finally turned to look at her, and his eyes were steady. For a man with a killer's mark on his skin, he had an unnervingly honest gaze. They got surveyors, deputies back in their claims, forcing settlers off their land. Deed or no? Saw it happen over in South Park just last month. It was a good story, plausible, designed to make him seem like a protector, a man on the side of the common folk. She wasn't buying it. My land's been deeded proper since 1848, she said, her voice like flint. She rose and took the tin box from the shelf, spreading the worn document on the table between them. Paid for, fair and square. He leaned over to look at it, and for a terrifying second, she thought he would snatch it. But he only studied the seals and signatures. It's legal, all right, he confirmed, but railroad men don't always care about legal. You might want to prepare yourself. Let them try, she said, her voice cold. She was talking about the railroad, but she was looking at him. I've held this land alone for 30 years. I'm not about to give it up now, not to anyone. The day passed in a state of high tension. Dale found more small tasks to do, mending a shutter, patching a hole in the roof. He was trying to earn her trust, to embed himself in her life before he struck. Maggie watched him, her mind a whirlwind of fear and calculation. She was an old woman, but she wasn't weak. She knew this land. She knew how to survive. When evening came, she would have to make her move. As dust settled, they sat by the fire again. The repaired stove glowed. He hadn't made a single threatening move. He'd worked hard, spoken respectfully, and shared his food. But the snake on his wrist was a constant, silent scream of warning. He noticed her Bible on the shelf. Its leather cover was worn smooth with age. Would you mind if I read some? He asked, his voice hesitant. It was the perfect ploy, a wolf cloaking himself in the words of the shepherd. The sheer gall of it took her breath away. Go ahead, she said, her voice flat. He took the Bible down with a reverence that seemed almost real. He handled it gently, his calloused fingers tracing the gilded letters on the cover. He opened it to the Psalms, his brow furrowed in concentration, and then he began to read. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. His voice was deep and steady, filling the small cabin with the ancient, comforting words. She watched him, her heart hammering against her ribs. He read with a simple, unadorned faith that was impossible to fake. The words flowed from him, not as a performance, but as a deep and familiar comfort. She found her own hands relaxing in her lap. The weight of the skillet seemed far away. Could she have been wrong? Could a man marked by outlaws find solace in the word of God? He finished the psalm and closed the book, his finger marking the page. He looked up and met her gaze. My pa used to read that to me, he said softly, before things went bad. He looked down at his wrist, at the coiled snake, and a shadow of deep shame crossed his face. I wasn't always a good man, Mrs. Keene. Rode with some hard men when I was young and foolish. Did things I ain't proud of. He looked back at her, his eyes pleading for understanding. But that life is long behind me. A man can change, can't he? The question hung in the air, a fragile bridge between his dark past and her fearful present. She wanted to believe him. Lord, she wanted to believe him. But trust was a currency she'd run out of 30 years ago. Before she could answer, a new sound cut through the night. A long, mournful howl, closer than usual. Then another, and another. Wolves. A whole pack. And they were coming for the chicken coop. Dale was on his feet in an instant, grabbing his Winchester. But as he reached the door, he paused. He looked back at her, then at the Bible still warm from his hands. They're hungry, he said, his voice grim. But I can't just... He stopped. A strange conflict played out on his face. He looked from his rifle to the book. And then he did something that made no sense at all. He put the rifle down. There's another way, he said, and walked out into the swirling snow, armed with nothing but a burning branch from the fire. Maggie rushed to the window, her heart in her throat. The wolves, a dozen of them, were circling the chicken coop, their eyes glowing like embers in the dark. They were a starving, desperate pack, bold enough to attack a human dwelling. A single man with a flaming stick stood no chance. This wasn't bravery, it was suicide. Unless it wasn't about the wolves at all. Was this another trick? A way to get her outside? To leave the cabin unprotected? She grabbed her own shotgun from above the door. The cold steel felt solid and real in her trembling hands. Dale walked calmly toward the frantic clucking of the hens. The wolves stopped their circling, their heads low, growls rumbling in their chests. The alpha, a huge gray male, took a step forward, its lips curled back from yellow fangs. Dale didn't slow down. He held the burning branch aloft, its light casting wild, dancing shadows across the snow. He began to speak, not shouting, not threatening. His voice was low and rhythmic, almost a chant. She couldn't make out the words, but the tone was hypnotic. He was speaking to the wolves, his voice carrying a strange authority. The pack grew still, their attention fixed on him. The alpha male cocked its head, its growl softening to a low whine. Dale took another step, then another, until he stood between the pack and the coop. He planted the burning branch in the snow, a single point of light in the vast, hungry darkness. Then he slowly, deliberately knelt down. He was making himself vulnerable, an offering. Maggie's finger tightened on the trigger of her shotgun. This was madness. But the wolves didn't attack. They watched him, their intelligent eyes gleaming. The alpha took a hesitant step closer, then another, until it was just feet from the kneeling man. It sniffed the air. Dale didn't move a muscle. Then the unbelievable happened. The wolf whined softly and sat down. One by one, the rest of the pack followed suit, sitting in a silent, watchful semicircle around the man and his small fire. Maggie could only stare, her mind refusing to process what she was seeing. It was like a story from the Bible itself, a man taming the wild beast with nothing but faith and courage. The chickens in the coop gradually quieted. The wind died down. A profound, almost holy silence fell over the yard. Dale remained kneeling for a long time. Finally, he rose slowly to his feet. He gave a slight bow to the wolves, then turned and walked back to the cabin, leaving the torch burning in the snow. The wolves remained where they were, a silent, gray congregation under the stars. He stepped back inside, his face pale but serene. He closed the door softly behind him. "Sometimes," he said, his voice quiet, "you don't have to fight to win. Sometimes you just have to show you mean no harm." He looked at her and the shame was gone from his eyes, replaced by a quiet strength. He looked at the shotgun in her hands. "I understand why you don't trust me, Mrs. Keene. That mark on my wrist, it's a part of who I was, but it's not who I am." He gestured to the Bible. "This book was a gift from a man who showed me a different path. His name was Elias Thorne. He was a preacher who wasn't afraid to walk among sinners." Maggie's blood ran colder than the snow outside. Elias Thorne. She knew that name. He was a circuit preacher who'd been found dead on the trail last spring, robbed and murdered, and his Bible, a family heirloom, had been stolen. The drifter in her cabin wasn't just a former outlaw. He was a killer, and he was holding the murder weapon in his hands. Her mind was a frozen landscape of terror. Every nerve screamed at her to raise the shotgun and end it, right here, right now. But her arms felt like lead. The image of him kneeling in the snow, surrounded by silent wolves, was burned into her vision. It didn't fit. Nothing fit. "Elias Thorne was a good man," she said, her voice a dry whisper. Dale's face lit up with a sad smile. "He was the best. He found me half dead in a Wyoming saloon, cleaned me up, gave me a job tending his horses. He was like the father I never had." His voice broke. "He taught me to read from that very Bible." "He was murdered," Maggie said, her eyes boring into him. "They say he was ambushed on the trail, robbed." The light in Dale's eyes died. A raw, gaping grief took its place. "I know. I was the one who found him." He sank onto the stool by the fire, his big shoulders slumped in defeat. "I'd gone into town for supplies. When I came back, he was gone. They'd taken everything. The horses, the wagon, all except this." He laid a hand on the Bible. "It was under his body. They must have missed it." He looked up at her, his face a mask of anguish. "I've been tracking the men who did it ever since. They came through here, headed for the railroad camps. One of them, the leader, he carried a rifle with a silver inlay on the stock. I'll know it when I see it. It was a perfect story. Too perfect. A tale of revenge and redemption. designed to play on her sympathies. But the facts were undeniable. A preacher was dead, and this man, this ex-outlaw, had the preacher's Bible. "Why didn't you go to the law?" she asked, the shotgun still heavy in her hands. A bitter laugh escaped his lips. "The law? Ma'am, in these parts, the law works for whoever pays the most. And right now, that's the railroad. The men who killed Elias, they work for the railroad." Another convenient lie, another thread in his elaborate web. The first rays of dawn were beginning to pierce the darkness. Outside, the torch had burned down to a smoldering stump. The wolves were gone. Had they ever been there at all? Or was her mind, starved of human contact for so long, finally starting to break? She had to know the truth. "There are survey markers at the edge of my property," she said, testing him. "Stakes with red flags." He nodded. "I saw them. That's how I know they're close." "Those stakes weren't there 3 days ago," she lied. She'd seen them herself a week past. It was a trap, a simple test of his honesty. Dale's brow furrowed. "Are you sure, ma'am? Because the ground around them was frozen solid. They looked like they'd been there a while." He had passed her test. A liar would have agreed with her. An honest man would have stated the truth as he saw it. The shotgun felt heavier now, and not with the weight of steel, but with the weight of her own doubt. For 30 years, her world had been simple. Black and white, good and evil, trust and betrayal. But this man, Dale, was a smudge of gray she couldn't categorize. A sinner who quoted scripture, a killer who tamed wolves, a drifter who spoke the truth. Suddenly from the woods came a new sound. Not the howl of a wolf, but the sharp crack of a twig. Someone else was out there, watching them. Dale was on his feet in a second, grabbing his Winchester, all traces of grief replaced by the coiled readiness of a predator. He moved to the window, peering into the pre-dawn gloom. "Get down," he whispered. Maggie dropped behind the table, her heart pounding. The quiet competence was back, the easy familiarity with violence. This was the man the snake tattoo belonged to. Another sound, a soft, scraping noise from the roof. They weren't just being watched, they were surrounded. "Stay here," Dale mouthed, and then he was gone, slipping out the back door as silently as a ghost. The cabin was plunged back into a terrifying silence. Maggie was alone again, crouched in the dark, with nothing but a shotgun and a heart full of contradictions. The man she thought was her captor had just become her only defender. And she realized with a sickening lurch that the threat wasn't inside the cabin at all. It had been waiting outside all along. The silence stretched, thin and brittle. Every creak of the old cabin sounded like a gunshot. Maggie stayed low, her shotgun pointed at the front door. The scraping from the roof had stopped. Was that a good sign or a bad one? Minutes felt like hours. The sun was climbing now, its weak light filtering through the grimy windows. She could hear nothing from outside, no shouts, no gunfire, just the wind whispering through the pines. Had they gotten him? Was she next? The back door creaked open. Maggie swung the shotgun around, her finger on the trigger. It was Dale. He was alone, his face grim. He held up a hand, signaling for her to stay quiet. "Just one man," he whispered, moving to her side. "An Apache scout, by the look of his tracks. He's gone now, but he wasn't alone. There were others, further back in the trees. They were watching the cabin." "Railroad men?" she breathed. "Don't think so," he said, his eyes scanning the tree line. "They moved too quietly. And this one, he left something behind." He opened his hand. In his palm lay a single black feather, tied with a piece of red sinew, an Apache marker. But what did it mean? A warning? A threat? "He was on the roof," Dale said, "right above the chimney." He looked at her, a dawning realization in his eyes. He wasn't trying to get in. He was listening. They had been overheard. Her accusations, his confession, the story of the murdered preacher, all of it. A bitter cold, colder than any winter storm, settled in Maggie's bones. She had lived on this land for 30 years, maintaining a careful, distant peace with the Apache who hunted these hills. She left them be, and they left her be. But now she and Dale had drawn their attention, and for the first time she was truly afraid of her wild, silent neighbors. The day passed in a haze of fear. Every shadow seemed to hold a watching figure. Every gust of wind sounded like a moccasin footstep. Dale didn't stray far from the cabin. He reinforced the door, boarded up the smaller back window, and cleaned his rifle with a slow, methodical calm that did nothing to soothe her shattered nerves. They've lived in these hills for generations, she told him, her voice trembling. The townspeople are afraid of them. They say they're savages. They're protectors, Dale corrected her gently. They're watching this land because the railroad threatens them as much as it threatens you. That feather, I don't think it was a threat. I think it was a message. They know we're against the railroad, too. Hope, fragile and unwelcome, tried to flutter in her chest. She crushed it. Hope was a fool's game. She learned that the hard way. Just before dusk, they heard the sound of horses, not the stealthy approach of Apache ponies, but the heavy, clumsy tread of shod mounts. Dale peered through a crack in the door. 3 riders, and they looked like trouble. Maggie looked too. The leader was a broad-shouldered man with a week's worth of beard and cruel, piggy eyes. He rode with the lazy arrogance of a man who'd never been told no, and the rifle in his saddle scabbard had a glimmer of silver inlay on the stock. Dale sucked in a breath. "That's him," he whispered, his voice shaking with a sudden, violent rage. "That's Burke. He's the one who killed Elias." The riders reined in, their horses kicking up snow. "This the Keene place," Burke shouted, not even bothering to dismount. Before Dale could stop her, Maggie stepped out onto the porch. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was being burned away by a hot, righteous anger. "It is," she said, her voice clear and strong. "And you're trespassing." Burke laughed, a nasty, grating sound. "Got an interest in this parcel, old woman? Railroad needs to see your deed." He looked past her, into the dim interior of the cabin. "Fetch it." "I don't fetch for any man," Maggie snapped, "and my deed is legal and proper." Just then, Dale stepped out of the cabin to stand beside her. His face was a thundercloud, his hands held carefully away from the rifle he'd left just inside the door. He didn't want to spook them into a fight they couldn't win. Burke's eyes narrowed as he saw Dale. A flicker of recognition, then a slow, ugly smile spread across his face. "Well, look what the cat dragged in. Dale Merrick, last I heard you were rotting in a saloon in Wyoming." "Last I heard you were back shooting unarmed preachers, Burke," Dale shot back, his voice low and dangerous. Burke's smile vanished. "You best watch your mouth, boy. You're talking to a man with friends." He gestured to the 2 hard-faced men with him. "She's not selling," Dale said, "and I'm suggesting you leave. Now." Burke's hand moved toward his rifle. "Or what, Merrick? You and the old woman gonna take on all 3 of us?" He was right. They were outgunned and outnumbered. Maggie's heart sank. It was over. "He is not alone." The voice came from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was calm, measured, and carried the weight of the mountains themselves. The riders whirled around, and Maggie's jaw dropped. Standing at the edge of the woods was the Apache scout from the morning, but he wasn't alone. Behind him, melting out of the shadows of the pines, were 20 more warriors. They stood in absolute silence, their bows drawn, their arrows aimed directly at the chests of Burke and his men. They had been there the whole time, watching, waiting. The black feather hadn't been a warning. It had been a promise. Burke's face went pale. His bravado evaporated like mist in the morning sun. He stared at the silent, deadly warriors, then at Maggie and Dale on the porch. He had made a fatal miscalculation. He thought he was coming to intimidate a lonely old woman. He had walked into an alliance he couldn't have imagined. The Apache scout, who moved with the grace of a mountain cat, stepped forward. "I am Nantan," he said, his eyes fixed on Burke. "This woman is a friend to our people. Her land is under our protection. You are not welcome here." "This ain't your business, savage," one of Burke's men sneered, but his voice shook. Nantan's gaze didn't waver. His arrow was nocked, the tip pointed directly at the man's throat. "Everything that happens in these mountains is our business. The iron snake you serve poisons the water and scares the game. It will not come here, not through this land." Burke held up a hand, a greasy smile plastered on his face. "Now hold on. Just a friendly misunderstanding. We were just making an offer." You made your offer, Dale said, his voice like cold steel. Now ride. And if I ever see you again, Burke, one of us isn't walking away. The hatred between the two men was a palpable thing, a raw, open wound in the cold winter air. Burke's eyes flickered from Dale to Nantan, to the silent ranks of warriors. He was trapped. This ain't over, he growled, pulling on his horse's reins. The railroad gets what it wants, one way or another. Then ride, Nantan said simply. Burke and his men wheeled their horses around and galloped away, their retreat hasty and undignified. As the sound of their hoofbeats faded, a profound silence returned to the clearing. Maggie's legs felt weak. She leaned against the porch railing, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Nantan and his warriors melted back into the trees as silently as they had appeared, all except for Nantan himself. He approached the porch, his footsteps making no sound on the snow. He stopped before Maggie and inclined his head respectfully. He will be back, he said, with more men, and with the lawman from the town, the one with the shiny star and the dark heart. The deputy, Maggie breathed. He's on the railroad's payroll. Yes, Nantan agreed. Paper shields and metal badges. They are the weapons of these men. You must fight them with your own paper. He looked at her pointedly. Your deed. You must take it to the town, to the man of God. Some of the whites will listen to him. Maggie's heart sank. Go into town? She hadn't been to town in 3 years. They thought she was a crazy old recluse. They whispered about her behind her back. They wouldn't help her. They won't believe me, she said, her voice full of despair. They will believe him, Nantan said, nodding toward Dale. And they will see you, a woman standing for her home. This is a fight you cannot win from up here. He looked at Dale. The man Burke. You have a blood feud with him. Dale nodded grimly. He murdered my friend. Then your path is clear, Nantan said. Justice for your friend and protection for this land are now the same thing. He looked from Dale's determined face to Maggie's fearful one. You have made an enemy of a powerful man, but you have also made powerful friends. Do not be afraid. With that, he turned and vanished into the twilight, leaving Maggie and Dale alone on the porch, the world tilting under their feet. The plan was simple and terrifying. They would ride into town at dawn. Maggie would show her deed to the preacher, Preacher Mackenzie, and Dale would tell his story. They would try to rally the townspeople to their side before Burke and the railroad could turn them all against her. It felt like a fool's errand, but as Maggie looked at Dale, his face set with a grim resolve to avenge his friend, and thought of Nantan's quiet strength, she felt a flicker of something she hadn't felt in years. It wasn't hope. It was fight. That night, for the first time in 30 years, Maggie did not lock her bedroom door. It wasn't about trust, not yet. It was about something more practical. It was about knowing that if trouble came in the night, they would face it together. The ride into town was a slow, tense journey through a world of white. Maggie, bundled in her best shawl and riding her old mule, felt the eyes of the town on her before they even reached the first house. Whispers followed them like ghosts down the main street. The widow Keene, riding with a young, handsome stranger. It was a scandal. Dale rode beside her, straight and tall, on a horse Nantan had provided, ignoring the stares and the murmurs. His presence was a solid, comforting wall against the town's judgment. They found Preacher Mackenzie in his church, a small, whitewashed building that smelled of old wood and beeswax. He was a kind man, but his face was etched with worry. Maggie, he said, surprise in his voice. It has been a long time. She laid her deed on his desk. Preacher, I need your help. The railroad is trying to take my land. He examined the paper, his brow furrowed. This deed is legal and binding, Maggie, filed proper. He sighed, removing his spectacles. But I've heard things, troubling things. The railroad has a lot of money and a lot of influence. Deputy Greeley, he shook his head. He is not the man he should be. Just as he spoke, the church doors swung open. Deputy Horace Greeley stood there, his hand resting on his pistol. He was a thin man with a weasel's face and a shiny badge that seemed too big for his chest. Behind him stood Burke and his men. Well, well, preacher, Greeley said, his voice dripping with false piety. Didn't expect to find you consorting with a known outlaw. He pointed a finger at Dale. That man there is Dale Merrick, wanted for assault and robbery in Wyoming. The preacher gasped. Maggie's blood turned to ice. That's a lie, Dale said, his voice dangerously calm. Is it? Greeley smirked, pulling out a worn wanted poster. Says right here, $500 reward. He looked at Maggie, his eyes full of malice. Looks like your hired man has been keeping secrets, widow. You've been harboring a fugitive. The world tilted. Wyoming. That was where Dale said he'd been cheated in a land deal. Was this what he meant? Or was the swindle, the murdered preacher, all of it, just an elaborate lie to cover his own crimes? The snake tattoo on his wrist suddenly felt like a brand, marking him for the liar and thief he truly was. He assaulted an officer of the law, Greeley continued, his voice rising for the benefit of the townspeople who were beginning to gather at the church door, drawn by the commotion. And I have a warrant for his arrest. He stepped forward, pulling out a pair of iron handcuffs. Dale didn't move. He looked at Maggie, his eyes pleading with her to believe him. But how could she? A wanted poster, a crooked deputy. It was all falling into place, and the picture it painted was terrifying. She had been a fool, an old, lonely fool. Don't do this, Horace, the preacher warned. This man was helping her. He was helping himself, Burke snarled from the doorway. To her land, most likely, after he was done with her, the townspeople murmured. The whispers turned dark. The crazy old widow had taken in a killer. Greeley lunged for Dale, and that's when it all went sideways. Dale moved with a speed that was breathtaking. He didn't fight. He didn't run. He sidestepped Greeley's clumsy attack, grabbed the preacher's heavy oak chair, and hurled it through the stained glass window behind the altar. Glass exploded outwards. Shouts erupted from the crowd. Meet me at the creek, Dale yelled at Maggie, and then he was gone, diving through the shattered window and disappearing into the trees behind the church. It was chaos. Greeley and his men scrambled after him, shouting threats. The townspeople surged forward. Maggie was left standing alone in the desecrated church, the wanted poster lying on the floor at her feet. She had a choice to make. She could believe the lawman, the wanted poster, the evidence of her own eyes. She could cut her losses, abandon this dangerous stranger, and try to make her peace with the railroad. Or she could believe a man with a snake tattoo and a murdered preacher's Bible, a man who tamed wolves and fought for a lonely old woman's home, a man who was waiting for her at the creek. She looked at the angry, frightened faces of the townspeople. She looked at the smug, triumphant face of Deputy Greeley as he organized a posse, and she made her choice. While everyone was distracted, Maggie slipped out the side door of the church. Her old mule was still tied to the hitching post. With trembling hands, she untied the reins, pulled herself into the saddle, and kicked the stubborn animal into a trot. She didn't head for her cabin. She didn't head for safety. She headed for the creek. The woods were alive with the sounds of the posse crashing through the underbrush. Shouts and curses echoed through the trees. They were hunting him like an animal. Maggie found Dale waiting for her in a thicket of willows by the rushing water. He was breathing hard, a long scratch bleeding on his cheek from the broken glass. They lied, he said, the words coming in a rush. Greeley, Burke, they were partners in that Wyoming land swindle. They cheated dozens of families, and the lawman they had in their pocket put out that warrant on me to shut me up when I threatened to expose them. It was an incredible story, a conspiracy stretching across 2 territories. How can I believe you? She asked, her voice shaking. He reached into his saddlebag. He didn't pull out a gun. He pulled out a bundle of papers, wrapped in oilcloth. These are the original deeds, the ones Greeley and Burke declared void, with the names of all the families they robbed. He shoved them into her hands. The preacher Elias was helping me get these to the circuit judge. That's why they killed him. It wasn't just about his Bible. It was about this. The papers felt heavy in her hands, heavy with the weight of stolen lives and broken dreams. You have to get these to Preacher Mackenzie, Dale said, his eyes wild with urgency. He'll know what to do. He's the only one in town we can trust. He grabbed the reins of her mule. I have to lead them away from you. Go, now. Before she could argue, he slapped the mule's rump. The animal bolted, carrying her away from the creek, away from Dale. She looked back once. Dale was on his feet, firing his rifle into the air to draw the posse's attention. He was sacrificing himself to give her a chance. Clutching the oilcloth bundle, Maggie rode like she hadn't ridden in 30 years. She didn't go back to the church. That would be the first place they'd look. She circled around using the ancient game trails Nantan had shown her over the years. She found the preacher at his small house behind the church, packing a saddlebag. He looked up, his face grim. "They've gone mad," he said. "Greeley's offering a reward to any man who brings Dale in, dead or alive." "It's all a lie," Maggie gasped, sliding off her mule. She thrust the bundle of papers at him. "Dale is innocent. Greeley and Burke are the real criminals. This is the proof." The preacher's eyes widened as he unwrapped the oilcloth. He shuffled through the deeds, his breath catching as he recognized names, saw the forged signatures, the fraudulent stamps. "Lord have mercy," he whispered. This is evil." A gunshot cracked through the woods, closer this time. Then another. "They're closing in on him," Maggie cried, her heart seizing with terror. The preacher's face hardened with a resolve she'd never seen before. "There's only one person who can stop this now," he said. "The circuit judge. He's in Silver Creek, 2 days' ride from here. But he's a hard man, and he listens to no one but the law." "Greeley is the law," Maggie said in despair. "Not the only law," the preacher said, a strange light in his eye. He looked at Maggie. "Your testimony and these papers. It might be enough, but you can't go alone. They'll be watching the roads." He strode to the back of his house and let out a long, piercing whistle. For a moment, there was only silence. Then from the shadows of the woods, Nantan appeared. He had heard everything. Nantan's eyes took in the situation in a single, sweeping glance. The papers in the preacher's hand, the fear on Maggie's face, the distant sound of the posse's hunt. "The boy led them toward the high canyon," he said, his voice calm. "He buys you time, but not much." "Can you get her to Silver Creek?" the preacher asked, his voice urgent. "Through the old paths? The ones the white men don't know?" Nantan looked at Maggie. He studied her face, her weathered hands, the stubborn set of her jaw. He saw not an old woman, but a warrior. "She will need a faster horse," he said simply. He let out a soft call, a perfect imitation of a hawk's cry. A moment later, 2 Apache warriors emerged from the trees, leading a lean, powerful paint horse. "This will not be an easy journey," Nantan warned her. "The mountains in winter are unforgiving." "I've lived with them for 30 years, Maggie said, her voice finding its strength. "They know me." The preacher pressed the oilcloth bundle back into her hands. "Godspeed, Maggie. You ride for more than just that boy's life now. You ride for the soul of this whole community." Maggie mounted the paint horse. It danced beneath her, alive with a fire her old mule had never known. She looked at the precious bundle in her hands, then toward the high canyon where Dale was fighting for his life. Her choice was made. The lonely widow of Keene Creek was about to become the most unlikely hero these mountains had ever seen. With Nantan and his warriors as her guides, she melted into the forest, leaving the town, the posse, and her 30 years of solitude behind her. The journey was a frozen hell. They traveled trails that were little more than goat paths, clinging to the sides of icy cliffs. The wind cut through her clothes, and the cold was a physical pain, a constant gnawing ache in her bones. Nantan and his men moved with a tireless, silent grace. But Maggie's body, softened by years of quiet living, screamed in protest. Every muscle ached. Her lungs burned, but she didn't complain. She thought of Dale, leading the posse on a desperate chase, and she pushed on. On the second night, huddled by a smokeless fire in a hidden cave, Nantan shared his food with her, dried venison and hard, gritty corn cakes. "Why are you doing this?" she asked him, her voice hoarse. "Helping us?" Nantan looked into the fire, his face like carved stone. 30 years ago, he began, his voice low. "My wife was sick with the white man's fever. Our medicine man could do nothing. We were afraid. We had been told all whites were our enemies. But my mother remembered a woman, a new settler, who was kind. She lived alone and was not afraid of us." He turned his dark eyes to her. My mother carried my wife to your cabin. You took them in. You used your own herbs, your own medicine. You sat with her for 3 days and 3 nights. You saved her life. Maggie stared at him, her mind reeling. She remembered. A young Apache woman, burning with fever. A terrified mother. She had done what any decent person would do. She had never known who they were. She had never spoken of it to anyone. You never asked for payment, Nanten continued. You never asked for thanks. You simply gave help when it was needed. My people do not forget such things. A debt of honor is a debt for life. We protect you, Maggie Keene, because you are one of us. You have the heart of the people. Tears froze on Maggie's cheeks. For 30 years, she had thought she was alone. But she had been part of a family all along, a community bound not by blood or law, but by a single act of kindness performed decades ago. The revelation gave her new strength. She was no longer just fighting for a stranger or for her land. She was fighting for her people. They reached the outskirts of Silver Creek at dawn on the third day, exhausted, frozen, but alive. The town was larger, busier, a bustling hub of mining and commerce. Nanten pointed to a large, imposing brick building. The judge is there. We can go no further. Our presence would cause trouble. He placed a hand on his heart. You walk with the strength of my people, Maggie Keene. Speak your truth. Maggie dismounted, her legs shaky. She clutched the oilcloth bundle to her chest and walked into the lion's den alone. The courthouse was a whirlwind of noise and self-importance. Men in suits bustled past her, ignoring the old woman in the worn frontier dress. She was told the judge was busy, that she needed an appointment, that she should come back next week. Maggie stood her ground. I have evidence of murder and fraud, she announced, her voice ringing out in the crowded hall. And it involves Deputy Horace Greeley. That got their attention. She was ushered into the chambers of Judge Silas Blackwood. He was a terrifying man, with a long white beard and eyes as cold and hard as riverstones. He looked at her with undisguised contempt. I am a busy man, madam, he boomed. This had better be important. With trembling hands, she spread the stolen deeds across his massive oak desk. She told him everything. Dale, Burke, the Wyoming swindle, the murder of the preacher, the railroad's attempt to steal her land. She spoke with the simple, unadorned eloquence of absolute truth. The judge listened, his expression unreadable. He examined the deeds, his expert eyes missing nothing. The forged signatures, the false seals. When she was finished, a long silence filled the room. An incredible story, the judge said finally, his voice laced with skepticism. A wanted outlaw who is secretly a hero, a corrupt deputy, a vast conspiracy, and your only witnesses are a dead preacher and a band of wild Indians. He leaned back in his chair. Why should I believe a word of this? Maggie's heart sank. It wasn't enough. She had failed. Dale was going to die. Just then, the door to the judge's chambers burst open. A flustered clerk ran in. Judge, you have to see this. The telegraph. It's been going all morning. He handed a stack of telegrams to the judge. Blackwood read the first one, his eyebrows shooting up. He read the second, and a low growl rumbled in his chest. By the time he finished the fifth, his face was a mask of thunderous rage. What is this? Maggie whispered. It's from Preacher Mackenzie, the judge said, his voice shaking with fury. After you left, he wasn't idle. He telegraphed every town, every lawman, every courthouse in the Wyoming Territory. He asked about the land swindle, about a deputy named Greeley and a railroad man named Burke. He slammed the telegrams down on the desk. These are the replies, dozens of them, all telling the same story. Stolen land, forged deeds, families ruined, and a dozen warrants for the arrest of Horace Greeley and his associate Burke for fraud, theft, and racketeering. The preacher had built a paper army. Judge Blackwood stood up, his towering frame radiating an aura of absolute authority. He was no longer a skeptical bureaucrat. He was the wrath of the law personified. They framed that boy, he roared. They used my laws, my courts, to cover their filthy crimes. They murdered a man of God, and they did it all for money. He pointed a finger at Maggie, but his eyes were no longer cold. They burned with a righteous fire. Madam, you have done this territory a great service. He strode to the door and bellowed, Get me the U.S. Marshal. The ride back was a blur. Maggie rode with the U.S. Marshal and a troop of 20 federal deputies. They rode hard, changing horses at every way station, their faces set with grim purpose. Judge Blackwood had given them one order: bring him Greeley and Burke, and bring back the boy, Dale Merrick, with a full pardon and the apologies of the court. But Maggie knew they were in a race against time. The posse had been hunting Dale for 3 days. He was one man against dozens in the dead of winter. Her heart was a cold, tight knot of fear. They could be too late. As they neared her valley, they saw smoke, thick, black plumes of it rising into the clear blue sky. No, Maggie whispered, her blood running cold. It wasn't the cabin. It was too much smoke and in the wrong direction. It was coming from the direction of the high canyon. They spurred their horses on, the marshal's men drawing their rifles. As they rounded the last bend, they saw it. The entire forest at the mouth of the canyon was ablaze. A massive forest fire, deliberately set, was raging out of control, blocking the only entrance to the canyon. And on the near side of the fire, watching the flames with satisfaction, were Deputy Greeley, Burke, and the remnants of their posse. They had trapped Dale in the canyon and set the woods on fire to flush him out or burn him alive. It's over, Burke was saying, a triumphant sneer on his face. He either burns or he comes out and we shoot him. Greeley laughed. Either way, we collect that reward and the railroad gets its land. Tidy. Horace Greeley! The marshal's voice boomed like the crack of doom. You are under arrest by the authority of the United States Federal Court. The posse froze, their faces a comical mixture of shock and terror. They were caught. Burke and Greeley exchanged a panicked glance, their alliance dissolving in an instant. Burke drew his pistol, but a dozen federal rifles were already aimed at his chest. He dropped the gun as if it were red hot. There's been a misunderstanding, Marshal, Greeley stammered, his face pale and sweaty despite the cold. The only misunderstanding, the marshal growled, is that you thought you could get away with it. The deputies swarmed them, clapping them in irons. Justice was swift and absolute, but Maggie's eyes were fixed on the raging inferno blocking the canyon. Dale, she cried, he's still in there. The marshal looked at the fire, his face grim. No man could survive that. The fire, the smoke. I'm sorry, ma'am. It's too late. Despair, black and suffocating, washed over Maggie. She had won. Justice had been served. But she had lost the one person who had brought light back into her lonely life. She slid from her horse, her legs giving way, and sank to her knees in the snow, her body racked with silent, heartbroken sobs. And then she heard it, a cry from high above. She looked up. On the highest ridge of the canyon wall, silhouetted against the blue sky, was a figure. He was waving. It was Dale. He was alive, but he was trapped. The fire blocked his way out, and the cliffs on either side were too steep to climb down. And then she saw something else. On the ridge with him were others, Nantan and his warriors. They had found Dale, guided him up through the secret paths of the canyon, away from the fire and the posse. They had saved him, but they were still stranded. The fire raged for 2 more days. The marshal's men, aided by the townspeople who had rushed to the scene, fought to contain it. Maggie refused to leave. She stood a silent vigil, her eyes fixed on the ridge where Dale and his Apache saviors waited. They had food and water. Nantan signaled with smoke signals, but they couldn't stay up there forever. Finally, the fire burned itself out, leaving a smoldering, blackened scar across the land. A path was cleared, and Dale was brought down, exhausted, smoke-stained, but whole. The moment his feet touched the ground, Maggie ran to him. She didn't think. She didn't hesitate. She threw her arms around him, burying her face in his chest, the smell of smoke and pine filling her senses. He held her tight, his arms a circle of strength and safety around her. You did it, Maggie, he whispered into her hair. You saved us all. She looked up at him, her face streaked with soot and tears. No man's touched me since 1850, she said, her voice choked with emotion. He smiled, a slow, gentle smile that reached all the way to his kind eyes. Well, Maggie Keene, he said softly, I reckon it's about time that changed. The town that had once whispered about her now welcomed her back as a hero. The story of her epic ride to Silver Creek, of her courage in the face of the judge, had spread like wildfire. The railroad company, facing a federal investigation and a mountain of bad publicity, withdrew its claim and fired Burke and his cronies. Deputy Greeley and his partners in crime were sent to a federal prison to face a justice they had so long denied others. The townspeople, shamed by their suspicion and inspired by her bravery, came to her cabin not with whispers, but with gifts: firewood, fresh-baked bread, quilts, and apologies. They helped her repair the fences, tend her chickens, and clear the fire-damaged trees. Her lonely cabin became a center of the community, a place of warmth and fellowship. Dale stayed. The $500 reward on the wanted poster was officially transferred to him, along with a full pardon and a letter of commendation from the judge. With the money, he bought the adjoining parcel of land and began to build his own small ranch. But he took every meal at Maggie's table. The bond between them was a quiet, sturdy thing, built not on fiery passion, but on shared danger, mutual respect, and a deep, abiding gratitude. He never pushed, never presumed. He simply was there, a steady presence, a helping hand, a warm voice reading the Psalms by the firelight. One evening, as spring was finally beginning to melt the last of the snow, he found her on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of purple and gold. He stood beside her, not speaking for a long time. Maggie, he said at last, his voice soft, my whole life I've been a drifter, running from a past I couldn't escape. I never thought I'd find a place to call home. He turned to her, his heart in his eyes. This place, you're my home now, if you'll have me. He reached out and took her hand. His touch was warm and sure. Maggie looked at their joined hands, his strong and calloused from a hard life, hers wrinkled and worn by 30 years of solitude. She thought of the promise she had made to herself, the bitter vow that had been her shield for so long, and she knew with a certainty that filled her soul that some promises were made to be broken. Dale Merrick, she said, a slow smile spreading across her face, I reckon it's about time I stopped being the widow Keene. They weren't young. Theirs was not a story of first love, but of last love, the best kind, a love that had been earned, tested by fire and ice, and had come through stronger than mountain granite. The lonely cabin was no longer lonely. It was a home, filled with laughter, shared work, and the quiet comfort of two souls who had found each other in the winter of their lives. And up in the high country, the people, the silent protectors of the mountains, looked down and saw that the debt of honor had been paid in full. This story is a powerful reminder that it's never too late for justice, for community, or for a second chance at happiness. The world is full of incredible stories just like this one, tales of quiet courage and unexpected heroes. If you enjoyed Maggie's journey and believe in the strength of the human spirit, don't forget to subscribe. You never know when the next story might be the one you need to hear.